For 20 years, I worked as an environmental consultant, saving every possible dollar with a singular dream in mind. My grandfather once owned a small cabin resort nestled in the mountains of Colorado, a place where I spent every summer of my childhood. When he passed away, financial troubles forced my parents to sell the property, a loss that haunted me well into adulthood. I promised myself that one day I would reclaim that piece of my history, or find something so similar that it would heal that old wound. The opportunity arrived last spring when I discovered Pine Haven Resort listed for sale. The property featured 8 rustic cabins surrounding a central lodge, all situated on 15 acres bordering national forest land. The moment I stepped onto the property, memories flooded back. The scent of pine, the gentle rustling of aspen leaves, the way sunlight filtered through the canopy. It was different from my grandfather's place, yet carried the same soul. I walked every inch of those grounds, running my hands along the weathered wood siding of cabins that had hosted families for generations. The owner, an elderly man named Harold, had operated the resort for 40 years, but his health was failing. "I want someone to love this place like I have," Harold told me as we sat on rocking chairs overlooking the small lake. "These cabins have stories in their walls." When I shared my childhood connection to a similar resort and my vision for respectful renovation, I saw tears in his eyes. 2 weeks later, I signed the papers transferring ownership of Pine Haven Resort to me. I had depleted my life savings and taken a substantial loan, but the property was mine. I spent the first month simply planning. Architectural drawings covered my dining table as I envisioned ways to preserve the rustic charm while updating necessary infrastructure. I hired local craftsmen who understood the importance of maintaining the character of the buildings while making them more comfortable for modern guests. The work began with enthusiasm, replacing rotting deck boards, updating plumbing, reinforcing foundations. My hands blistered and my back ached, but each improvement brought me closer to realizing my vision. The future seemed bright until a crisp autumn morning when I discovered an official-looking envelope stuck to my front door. I opened it while walking back to the main lodge, expecting perhaps some routine county paperwork. What I found instead made me stop in my tracks. The letter was from something called the Mountain Vista Homeowners Association, claiming jurisdiction over my property. According to this document, my resort was subject to their rules and regulations, rules I had never seen, agreed to, or even known existed. The sun dipped behind the mountains as I read through the letter a fourth time, casting long shadows across the cabins I had poured my heart into. The HOA demanded immediate compliance with their aesthetic standards, including a complete color scheme change, removal of rustic elements they deemed unsightly, and limitations on commercial operation that would effectively cripple my business before it even opened. The final paragraph contained a thinly veiled threat. Failure to comply would result in escalating fines and potential legal action. I stood there as darkness fell completely, the paper trembling slightly in my hand. Something precious was being threatened by strangers who had no connection to the history or heart of this place. How could my property be subject to an HOA that no one, not Harold, not the real estate agent, not the title company, had ever mentioned? As night enveloped the resort, I felt a cold sense of dread settling over my paradise found. The following morning, I drove to the county records office to investigate this supposed HOA jurisdiction. The clerk confirmed my worst fears. A zoning change 15 years prior had indeed incorporated my property into the Mountain Vista Community Development, despite being physically separated from it by half a mile of forest. Somehow this critical detail had been overlooked during my purchase process. I left the office with a 3-inch binder containing the complete HOA covenant documents, my mind racing with implications. Back at the resort, I spread the papers across my kitchen table, the stack towering like a physical manifestation of bureaucratic intimidation. What I discovered was nothing short of outrageous. The aesthetic requirements alone would cost upwards of $80,000. All cabins needed to be painted mountain sage, with desert sand trim, all wooden features replaced with approved composite materials, and rustic signage exchanged for standardized markers. Business operation restrictions limited guest capacity to levels that would make profitability impossible, prohibited outdoor activities after 8:00 p.m., and required approval for any events. I drafted a carefully worded email to the HOA board requesting a meeting to discuss these requirements, explaining my situation as a new owner who had not been informed of the HOA during purchase. The response came from Richard Keller, HOA president, whose condescending tone was evident even through email. Ignorance of the covenants does not exempt compliance. The board meets on the 15th. You may have 5 minutes to present your case. I arrived at the meeting professionally dressed and with a reasonable compromise proposal in hand. The boardroom fell silent as I entered, 7 people seated around a polished table, their expressions a mixture of indifference and annoyance. Richard Keller sat at the head, a man in his 60s with meticulously combed silver hair and cold blue eyes that assessed me like I was an unwelcome intrusion. "I understand there are standards to maintain," I began, "but the resort has historical significance. I am proposing targeted updates that respect both the character of the property and the general aesthetic standards of the community." Richard interrupted before I could continue. "The standards exist precisely to prevent subjective interpretations of what constitutes appropriate appearance. Your property is visible from Mountain Vista Drive and affects property values throughout the community." Another board member, a woman with a permanent frown, added, "We have already received complaints about construction noise and increased traffic on access roads." For 40 minutes I attempted to reason with them, suggesting phased implementation to spread out costs, offering to add additional landscaping as a buffer between the resort and other properties. Each suggestion was summarily dismissed. The meeting ended with Richard sliding a formal notice across the table. I had 30 days to begin compliance or daily fines would commence. Over the next 2 months, I tried every avenue of communication. I sent detailed proposals with architectural renderings. I requested variance considerations based on the property's pre-existing use. I even offered to host a community open house to address neighbors' concerns directly. Each attempt was met with increasingly aggressive responses and additional violation notices for infractions as minor as having firewood stacked visibly on cabin porches. The fines began accumulating, $100 per day per violation. My renovation budget was being drained by these penalties rather than actual improvements. Construction crews became nervous about continuing work when HOA representatives began photographing them and taking notes. My dream was being systematically dismantled by people who seemed to take pleasure in wielding their authority. Late one night, after receiving a particularly threatening letter that included potential liens against the property, I sat at my computer staring at a blank document. The weight of 5 months of harassment and intimidation pressed down on me. My financial reserves were depleting rapidly. Yet something inside me had reached a breaking point, not of surrender, but of resistance. I began typing a formal response to the HOA board. No more compromise proposals or polite requests for understanding. The letter was direct and unequivocal. After careful review of the covenants, historical documentation, and consultation with legal counsel, I am formally notifying the Mountain Vista HOA that I will not be implementing the demanded changes to Pine Haven Resort. I detailed the failure of disclosure during property transfer, the historical status of the buildings, and the economically prohibitive nature of their requirements. I concluded with the simple, powerful word that I had been afraid to use until now: no. I printed the letter, signed it, and sealed it in an envelope. As I placed it on the counter for mailing the next day, I felt both relief and apprehension. I knew this refusal would escalate the conflict, but continuing to comply with their unreasonable demands would mean the certain death of my dream. Whatever came next, I would face it standing my ground. The response to my refusal was immediate and ruthless. The very afternoon after delivering my letter, 2 HOA board members appeared on my property with clipboards, methodically documenting every nail, board, and fixture they deemed in violation. They ignored my presence entirely, treating me as invisible while they trespassed across my land. When I approached them, the shorter man simply stated, "We are conducting an official HOA inspection as allowed under Section 7.3 of the Covenant," before turning his back to continue photographing a cabin porch. The next morning, a thick envelope arrived containing violation notices for 37 new infractions, each carrying its own daily fine structure. The total potential penalties had increased from hundreds to thousands of dollars per day. Attached was a personal note from Richard Keller. "Perhaps this will help clarify the seriousness of your situation." The psychological warfare escalated daily. HOA representatives began conducting inspections at increasingly intrusive hours, early mornings, weekends, even at dusk with flashlights. They documented everything from peeling paint to the temporary equipment, containers my renovation crew used. My contractors started receiving anonymous calls questioning the legitimacy of their permits. 2 crews quit within the same week, citing concerns about getting caught in a legal dispute. I installed security cameras around the property, which captured board members bringing prospective home buyers from their development to point at my cabins while shaking their heads disapprovingly. One recording even picked up Richard telling a couple, "This eyesore will be addressed soon. The owner is being dealt with." Despite the mounting pressure, I continued renovation work with the remaining contractors brave enough to stay. I woke before dawn to review plans and often worked alongside the crews until sunset, determined not to let the HOA derail my progress. The main lodge renovations were nearly complete, and 3 cabins had been fully updated while maintaining their rustic charm. I focused on these small victories while trying to ignore the growing stack of violation notices. Strange incidents began occurring with unsettling frequency. Tools disappeared from locked sheds. One morning I discovered that someone had dumped paint thinner on newly planted landscaping, killing dozens of native shrubs. The tires on my truck were slashed while I was in town purchasing supplies. Each time I filed police reports, but with no witnesses and inconclusive camera evidence, the investigations led nowhere. The tension peaked one evening when I received an anonymous call. People who do not fit into Mountain Vista tend to move along, one way or another. I reported the threat to local police, who promised to increase patrols but seemed unconvinced of any serious danger. 2 nights later, I awoke at 2:17 a.m. to an unusual orange glow reflecting on my bedroom wall. For a moment, my sleep-addled brain thought it was early sunrise, until I registered the flickering quality of the light and the faint smell of smoke. I rushed to the window and felt my heart stop. 3 of my most recently renovated cabins were engulfed in flames. I ran outside into the pouring rain, barefoot and still in my pajamas. The contrast was surreal, fire raging while rain fell steadily from the dark sky. I called 911 frantically as I ran toward the cabins, hopping against hope that I could salvage something, anything. The heat pushed me back like an invisible wall. All I could do was watch helplessly as firefighters arrived and battled the inferno that was consuming months of work and decades of history. Through the chaos of emergency lights, smoke, and steam from rain hitting hot embers, I noticed several vehicles parked at the edge of my property. Richard Keller stood with 3 other HOA board members under umbrellas, observing the destruction with expressions that could only be described as satisfaction. When Richard noticed me watching, he did not look away or show any shame. Instead, he gave a small, knowing smile before turning to leave. I collapsed to my knees in the mud, rain mixing with tears on my face. The cabins my grandfather had once admired, the structures I had poured my savings and soul into restoring, were now blackened skeletons against the night sky. As dawn broke, revealing the full extent of the devastation, I knew with absolute certainty this was no accident. This was a message: defy the HOA and watch your dreams burn. The following days passed in a blur of shock and procedural motions. Fire investigators combed through the charred remains of the cabins, taking samples and photographs. I provided them with my security camera footage, though the cameras had been positioned to monitor the main entrance and lodge, not the now destroyed cabins. The investigator noted multiple ignition points, strongly suggesting arson, but stopped short of making official accusations without more concrete evidence. When the insurance adjuster arrived, his expression told me everything before he spoke a word. "This is complicated," he said, reviewing the file of HOA complaints and violations. "The insurance company has concerns about covering the claim when there are active disputes regarding code compliance on the property." He explained that the HOA had already contacted the insurance company, suggesting that my refusal to comply with safety standards had created the conditions for the fire. I sat on a fallen log facing the ruins, financial statements spread across my lap. The numbers were merciless. Without the insurance payout, I could not afford to rebuild. The ongoing HOA fines were accumulating at a rate that would force foreclosure within months. My dream, my connection to my grandfather, my entire investment was literally and figuratively in ashes. That evening, as I sat in the main lodge with a cold cup of coffee, a gentle knock at the door startled me. I opened it to find Margaret Chen, an elderly woman I recognized from neighboring property but had never spoken with. She stood holding a container of homemade soup and a folder. "I saw what happened," she said simply. "May I come in?" Margaret had lived in the area for 30 years and had witnessed the formation of the Mountain Vista HOA. Over soup that I could barely taste, she revealed that Richard Keller had spearheaded the incorporation of surrounding properties into the HOA jurisdiction through questionable zoning maneuvers. "Your resort is not the first business he has targeted," she explained. "There used to be a small bed and breakfast on the other side of the development. The owners left after 2 years of harassment." She slid the folder across the table. "These are notes from HOA meetings I attended before I stopped going. Richard has plans for expansion, a Mountain Vista Phase 2 that would include luxury vacation rentals. He has been trying to acquire peripheral properties for years." I spent that night reading through Margaret's documents, my mind racing with implications. The next morning, I drove to the county offices again, this time requesting all public records related to Mountain Vista development plans. The clerk recognized me from my previous visit and hesitated. "You might want to speak with Jamal in planning and development. He handles the approvals for expansion projects in that area." Jamal Thompson, a soft-spoken man with kind eyes and a serious demeanor, listened to my situation with growing concern. Mountain Vista has submitted preliminary applications for a significant expansion, he confirmed. They are seeking special use permits and infrastructure funding approval from the County Development Commission. Something about the way he emphasized funding approval caught my attention. Who oversees those approvals? I asked. The Regional Development Oversight Committee, he replied. They review all applications for public funding of private development infrastructure. A strange coincidence began to form in my mind. This committee, what exactly do they control? Essentially, they determine which development projects receive county-backed bonds and infrastructure support. Without their approval, developments in unincorporated areas cannot access public utilities expansion or road improvements. My heart began racing as I pulled out my business card and handed it to him. Jamal, I work as an environmental consultant for the Eastern District Water Conservation Board. Part of my role involves serving on the Regional Development Oversight Committee as the Environmental Impact Assessment Coordinator. Jamal's eyes widened as he connected the dots. He pulled up a document on his computer and turned the screen toward me. There, on the pending applications list, was Mountain Vista Phase 2 development, with an estimated $4.2 million in requested infrastructure support. And there, on the committee assignment sheet, was my name listed as one of 7 voting members who would evaluate and approve or deny their application. Have they been notified of the committee assignments yet? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Not yet. Assignments were just finalized yesterday. Notices go out next week. I walked out of the county offices in a daze, my mind reeling with the implications. The HOA that had terrorized me for months, that had potentially burned down my cabins, that had pushed me to the brink of financial ruin, now needed my professional approval for their expansion plans. The same people who had shown me no mercy were now unknowingly dependent on my judgment and signature. As I drove back to my damaged resort, watching the burned cabins come into view against the mountain backdrop, a sense of calm determination replaced my despair. For the first time in months, I felt something new stirring within me. Not just hope, but the quiet, powerful knowledge that the tables had turned. The HOA had burned down my cabins, not realizing that I controlled their future. I spent the next 3 days confirming my authority and understanding the scope of my position. As the Environmental Impact Assessment Coordinator for the Regional Development Oversight Committee, I held one of 7 votes that would determine the fate of the Mountain Vista expansion project. More importantly, my environmental assessment report carried significant weight with the other committee members, who typically deferred to subject matter experts in their voting decisions. I reviewed the Mountain Vista application materials that were available in the public domain. Their expansion plans were ambitious: 20 luxury vacation homes, a clubhouse with pool, and a small commercial area, all requiring extensive infrastructure development including road widening, sewer line extension, and water system upgrades. Without county funding support for this infrastructure, the project would be economically unfeasible. My professional ethics prevented me from allowing personal grievances to influence my official duties, but nothing prevented me from conducting an extremely thorough and meticulous review. I would neither approve nor deny their application based on our conflict. I would simply ensure that every regulation, requirement, and environmental consideration was examined with microscopic precision. With newfound purpose, I transformed my approach to the HOA battle. Instead of reacting defensively, I began gathering information methodically. I hired a private investigator to research the HOA board members, particularly Richard Keller. I documented every interaction, every violation notice, every piece of evidence suggesting harassment. I installed additional security cameras covering every angle of my property. The fire investigation was proceeding slowly, but I maintained regular contact with the detective assigned to the case. When he mentioned that they needed more substantial evidence to pursue criminal charges, I decided to approach other homeowners who might have experienced similar intimidation. Margaret Chen helped arrange discreet meetings with residents who harbored grievances against the HOA leadership. We met at a coffee shop in the next town, away from prying eyes. One by one, they shared stories of excessive fines, selective enforcement, and intimidation tactics. Martin Diaz described how the HOA had forced him to remove a memorial garden planted for his late wife because it used non-approved plants. Ellen Foster showed me documentation of fines totaling over $15,000 for a disputed fence height measurement that was eventually proven to be within guidelines. They never apologized or reversed the fines, even when proven wrong, Ellen explained, her hands trembling slightly as she sipped her coffee. Most people just pay to make the harassment stop. With each conversation, more homeowners agreed to document their experiences and potentially speak publicly about the HOA's abuses. A retired attorney in the community offered to review the HOA covenant for potential legal vulnerabilities. A former building inspector pointed out several instances where the HOA had enforced rules that contradicted county building codes. I consulted with my own attorney about how to proceed without compromising my professional position. Document everything, maintain absolute professionalism, and create clear separation between your personal property dispute and your official duties, she advised. This is a narrow ethical path you are walking. After 2 weeks of preparation, I made my first strategic move. I sent a formal letter to the Mountain Vista HOA board in my capacity as a committee member, requesting comprehensive environmental impact documentation for their expansion project, including historical assessments dating back 5 years. The letter was purely professional, with no mention of our ongoing dispute. 3 days later, I received a response from their development consultant, promising the requested materials within 2 weeks. There was no indication that they had made the connection between the property owner they had been harassing and the committee member requesting documentation. My second move targeted the financial aspect of their operation. Through public records requests, I obtained the HOA's financial statements for the past 3 years. The retired attorney helping our cause identified several procedural irregularities in how special assessment funds had been allocated. We drafted a formal complaint to the state agency overseeing homeowners associations, requesting an audit. Meanwhile, I focused on rebuilding what I could at the resort. The insurance company had finally agreed to cover part of the fire damage after pressure from my attorney, though they withheld a significant portion pending resolution of the HOA dispute. I used the funds to begin clearing the burned areas and salvaging what materials could be repurposed. The HOA continued their campaign of harassment, seemingly emboldened by the fire's destruction. Violation notices arrived daily, each more nitpicking than the last. Richard Keller made a point of driving slowly past my property each evening, observing the cleanup efforts with obvious satisfaction. What Richard did not know was that each action they took now strengthened my position. Every unreasonable fine, every harassment incident was meticulously documented and added to the growing file of evidence. The private investigator had uncovered connections between Richard's personal real estate holdings and the proposed expansion areas, suggesting potential conflicts of interest in his HOA leadership decisions. 1 month after the fire, I received an email notification that the Mountain Vista Phase 2 application had been formally submitted for committee review, with the first hearing scheduled in 3 weeks. The same day, an unmarked envelope appeared in my mailbox containing internal HOA board meeting minutes that someone had leaked to me. In them, Richard explicitly discussed strategies to remove the resort eyesore to clear the path for Phase 2 viewscapes. That evening, I sent a simple email to the Mountain Vista HOA board secretary. Please add me to the agenda for public comments at next week's HOA meeting. I have important information to share regarding the Phase 2 development application. Within 10 minutes, my phone rang. It was Richard Keller, his voice tightly controlled but with an undercurrent of confusion. I received a notification about your request to speak at the meeting. I thought we had made our position clear regarding your property violations. This is not about my property, Mr. Keller, I replied calmly. This is about the Phase 2 development application currently before the Regional Development Oversight Committee. I believe the HOA board would be interested in hearing my insights on the approval process. A long silence followed before Richard responded, his voice now containing a note of uncertainty. And what is your connection to this committee? I serve as the Environmental Impact Assessment Coordinator, I said simply. I look forward to discussing it at the meeting. Good evening, Mr. Keller. I ended the call and looked out at the mountain sunset casting golden light across my damaged but still beautiful property. For the first time since the fire, I smiled. The first move in this chess game had been made. Richard Keller had just realized he had been trying to destroy the very person who held the future of his development dreams in their hands. The Mountain Vista Community Center was unusually crowded for a Tuesday evening HOA meeting. Word had spread about my scheduled appearance, though few knew exactly what to expect. I arrived 10 minutes before the 7:00 p.m. start time, dressed in a professional suit and carrying a slim portfolio containing only the essential documents I needed. I took a seat in the back row, acknowledging the subtle nods from homeowners I had met with previously. Richard Keller entered from a side door with the other board members, his eyes immediately scanning the room until they found me. His typically confident demeanor appeared slightly shaken. The meeting began with standard procedures: approval of previous minutes, treasurer's report, committee updates, all conducted with an underlying tension that even casual observers could sense. When the agenda reached public comments, Richard called my name with forced neutrality. You have requested time to address the board. Please keep your comments to 3 minutes. I walked to the podium, placed my portfolio on the surface, and surveyed the room before speaking. Approximately 50 homeowners were present, more than triple the usual attendance according to Margaret. The 7 board members watched with expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. Good evening. For those who do not know me, I am the owner of Pine Haven Resort, I began calmly. I am also, as some of you may have recently discovered, the Environmental Impact Assessment Coordinator for the Regional Development Oversight Committee currently reviewing the Mountain Vista Phase 2 development application. A murmur rippled through the audience. Richard's jaw tightened visibly. I want to be absolutely clear that these two roles are entirely separate. My professional assessment of the Phase 2 application will be based solely on environmental impact factors, regulatory compliance, and county development guidelines. My personal experience as a property owner within the HOA jurisdiction will have no bearing on my professional evaluation. I removed a document from my portfolio. That said, I believe the board and community members should be aware of several concerning factors that may impact the application's success. First, Preliminary environmental scans indicate potential wetland designation issues in the proposed construction areas that were not addressed in the initial submission. Board member Patricia Wilson interrupted. This is hardly the appropriate forum for. I have the floor for my allocated 3 minutes, I stated firmly, continuing without pause. Second, the infrastructure funding request contains contingencies that are dependent on property acquisitions not yet finalized. Third, there appear to be discrepancies between the development plans submitted to the HOA members and those submitted to the county, particularly regarding density and usage classifications. Richard leaned forward. We appreciate your professional insights, but perhaps these technical details would be better addressed in the appropriate county forums. I agree completely, I replied. However, as these issues may significantly impact the project timeline and possibly its viability, I felt homeowners deserve transparency about potential risks to a project that will require significant HOA financial commitment. I then turned a page in my portfolio. Moving to my second topic this evening, I wish to address the pattern of selective enforcement and harassment that several homeowners, including myself, have experienced. I proceeded to outline, with specific dates and documentation references, the escalating campaign against my property, including the suspicious timing of the fire that destroyed 3 of my cabins. Richard pounded his gavel. This is outside the meeting agenda. Your time is up. Actually, came a voice from the audience, I move that we extend the speaker's time. It was Martin Diaz, standing confidently despite Richard's glare. I believe this information is directly relevant to HOA operations. I second the motion, called Ellen Foster from across the room. Patricia Wilson protested, this is not how. According to Bylaw 5.2, any procedural motion properly seconded must be put to immediate vote, interjected the retired attorney who had been helping our cause. No discussion required. Richard had no choice but to call the vote, which passed overwhelmingly. His face flushed with anger as he grudgingly said, "You may continue for 3 additional minutes." I nodded gratefully to the homeowners who had supported me. Thank you. I have documented 37 instances of selective rule enforcement against my property, including violations cited for conditions that exist unchallenged on multiple HOA board members' properties. I placed photographs on the document camera that projected onto the wall screen, showing side-by-side comparisons of my cited violations and identical uncited conditions at Richard's home. The audience reaction was immediate, gasps and murmurs as people recognized the blatant double standard. I continued methodically. Beyond selective enforcement, I have experienced what can only be described as coordinated harassment, culminating in the fire that destroyed 3 cabins on my property. That is a serious accusation, Richard interrupted, his voice tight. The fire investigation found no evidence of. The fire investigation is ongoing, I corrected. However, I have obtained a copy of HOA meeting minutes from March 15th in which you, Mr. Keller, specifically discussed, and I quote, removing the resort eyesore to improve Phase 2 viewscapes. I placed the document on the camera, highlighting the damning sentence. The room erupted in shocked conversations. Richard attempted to regain control, banging his gavel repeatedly. Those minutes are confidential board materials. How did you? They were provided by a concerned board member, I stated, not revealing my source. Additionally, I have statements from 7 contractors who were contacted by HOA board members and pressured to abandon work on my property. One by one, other homeowners began standing, each adding their own experiences of intimidation and unreasonable enforcement. Martin described his wife's memorial garden destruction. Ellen detailed her fence-fine nightmare. Others shared similar stories, creating a damning pattern of abusive leadership. Richard made one final attempt to shut down the meeting, standing and declaring, "This meeting is adjourned due to disorderly conduct." "Actually," came Margaret Chen's steady voice from the side of the room, "Bylaw 8.4 states that a meeting can only be adjourned by majority vote if the full agenda has not been addressed. We still have committee reports and new business on the agenda." The board secretary, looking increasingly uncomfortable, nodded confirmation when Richard glared at her questioningly. I concluded my presentation. "I am formally requesting a special investigation committee be formed to review these documented instances of selective enforcement and potential misconduct. I further suggest that board members mentioned in these complaints recuse themselves from Phase 2 development decisions until the investigation is complete." The motion was quickly seconded and, despite Richard's vehement objections, passed by an overwhelming margin. As the meeting continued with other homeowners now confidently raising additional concerns, Richard Keller sat silently, his face ashen. The power structure he had carefully built over years was visibly crumbling before him. When the meeting finally adjourned 3 hours later, several homeowners approached to thank me for speaking out. As I gathered my materials, I noticed Richard standing alone by the exit, watching me with a mixture of anger and disbelief. Our eyes met briefly across the room. No words were necessary. We both knew that everything had changed. His weapon of bureaucratic terror had been turned against him, and he had no defense against the truth finally spoken aloud. The aftermath of the confrontation unfolded with remarkable speed. The day after the HOA meeting, 2 board members submitted their resignations, citing personal reasons, but clearly wanting to distance themselves from the growing scandal. 3 days later, the county sheriff's office announced they were reopening the investigation into the cabin fires based on new evidence provided by multiple witnesses. Richard Keller did not go quietly. He initially attempted to discredit me through a series of emergency HOA communications, claiming I was using my professional position to wage a personal vendetta. His efforts backfired when the Regional Development Oversight Committee chairman issued a public statement confirming that I had proactively disclosed the potential conflict of interest and would be recusing myself from any direct decisions regarding the Mountain Vista application, while still fulfilling my environmental assessment duties. The following week brought another significant development. The state agency overseeing homeowners associations announced a formal audit of Mountain Vista HOA financial records based on substantial evidence of procedural irregularities. Richard was suspended from his position pending investigation results. With Richard's influence diminished, other homeowners began sharing information more freely. A municipal worker came forward with evidence that Richard had falsified documents during the original zoning change that had incorporated my property into the HOA jurisdiction. This revelation opened the possibility that my resort might legally be exempt from HOA control entirely. As these investigations proceeded, I focused on rebuilding. The insurance company, now facing potential bad faith claims given the evidence of targeted harassment, expedited my full claim payment. Construction crews returned, many offering discounted rates after learning the full story of what had occurred. I decided to use some of the salvaged materials from the burned cabins in the new construction, charred beams repurposed as fireplace mantels, blackened wood incorporated into accent walls. These elements would serve as reminders of resilience rather than victimhood. The new cabins would honor the history they replaced while being stronger, more efficient, and even more characterful. 2 months after the confrontation, Richard Keller was charged with criminal mischief, insurance fraud, and misappropriation of HOA funds. The evidence against him mounted as investigators uncovered a pattern of using HOA resources for personal gain, including steering contracts to companies owned by family members. While arson charges related to my cabins remained under investigation, the other charges were sufficient to end his reign permanently. With Richard and his allies removed from power, the remaining board members and newly elected replacements approached me about helping restructure the HOA governance model. I agreed to serve on a special committee focused on creating more transparent, fair operating procedures. Together, we rewrote critical bylaws to prevent future abuses, implementing term limits, requiring competitive bidding for contracts, establishing an independent review process for violation complaints, and creating clear conflict of interest policies. The Mountain Vista Phase 2 development was significantly modified following the environmental assessment. Rather than 20 luxury homes crowded onto sensitive land, the revised plan featured a smaller, more sustainable development that preserved wetland areas and incorporated community green spaces. The irony was not lost on anyone. The Project Richard had been willing to burn down my cabins to protect actually emerged stronger and more valuable with proper environmental stewardship. Spring arrived as the final touches were being completed on the rebuilt Pine Haven Resort. The main lodge stood proudly at the center, its rustic character enhanced.